The rain hit the front windows of Boyd's Family Market so hard it sounded like gravel, and at 9 o'clock that Friday night in Providence, that store was the only lit building left on the block. Delaney Marsh was 27, 7 months pregnant, and she'd been on her feet for 8 hours because her boss had told her twice that cashiers don't sit. Harlan Boyd was 54, heavyset, and he never went anywhere without that clipboard he carried around the store like a weapon. That night he was holding a bag of day-old bread she'd pulled from the throwaway bin at the end of her shift, and in his other hand he held a written warning he had typed up days before she ever touched it. Apron off, badge on the belt, right now. She told him there was a storm outside. He asked her if she thought weather changed what stealing was. 3 customers stood frozen near the registers and didn't say a word. An old stock clerk set down a case of canned soup and started to step forward, and Harlan looked at him one time, just once, and the old man stayed exactly where he was. So she untied the apron, laid her badge on the conveyor belt, and walked out into water that came up over her ankles before she'd cleared the curb. Then she looked toward the far corner of the lot, where the only thing she had left in this world should have been sitting. It wasn't there anymore. She turned around, put her hand flat on the glass, and asked for one phone call. Just one. Inside, Harlan Boyd looked at her exactly one time. Then he reached over and shut off the lights at the front of the store. What that man didn't know, standing in the dark of a building he thought was his, was that he didn't own it. He rented it. And the name on that lease belonged to someone nobody on that street said out loud without lowering their voice first. 3 years later, Harlan Boyd would be down on his knees on wet pavement, soaked through, looking up at the woman he'd pushed out into a storm, begging her for something he had no right to ask for. If this story pulls you in, give it a like so more folks can find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And subscribe, because this one deserves an ending you'll remember. Now let's go back to where all of this started. 3 months before that night, Boyd's Family Market was still the only place in the world willing to hire Delaney Marsh, and she still believed that if she stayed quiet long enough, everything would eventually pass. Every Friday night was exactly the same. 15 minutes before closing, Harlan Boyd would come out of his office with a clipboard in his hand and tap 3 times against the side of the counter, and every cashier knew what to do. They pulled out their cash drawers, held them against their stomachs, then lined up in the middle of aisle 4, right at the widest point, right where customers still choosing groceries had to walk around them to reach the registers. Harlan called it a cash count. No one in the store called it that. They counted their money aloud, 1 bill at a time, loudly enough for him to hear from the other end of the aisle, while a housewife pushed her cart past and tried not to look, while 2 children waiting for their mother beside the cereal shelves turned their heads to watch. Delaney stood third in line. She had been on her feet for 8 straight hours, and the ache in her back had spread all the way down into both hips. But she still stood straight because she understood that in a place like this, someone leaning against a shelf would be remembered longer than someone who counted wrong. When her turn came, she counted slowly and clearly. When she finished, she looked up, and the owner held out his hand. Harlan counted it again. He went through the entire stack once, set the money down, then counted it a second time. And throughout that second count, no one in line dared breathe too loudly, because they had all learned that when Harlan Boyd counted twice, he wasn't counting anymore. He was getting ready to say something he had already decided on beforehand. He said her drawer was short. Delaney said she had counted it twice before bringing it out. He asked her again, raising his voice just enough for it to carry all the way to produce, whether she was telling him he had counted wrong in his own store. She went silent. She looked directly at the button on his shirt instead of into his eyes, and she said nothing. At the end of the aisle, a shopping cart stopped, then slowly backed away as the customer decided to take another route. Harlan pulled out a wage deduction receipt that was already clipped to his board, placed it on the counter, and turned it toward her. Delaney took the pen. She signed. She signed without reading it, not because she didn't care, but because she knew that if she read it, she would have to think about what that money had been meant for, and if she thought about that, she wouldn't be able to keep her face still. He lifted the paper, checked the signature, nodded, then turned toward the next person in line, as though he had just finished some minor chore. And that was exactly when the bell over the door rang. At Boyd's, there was nothing unusual about the bell ringing at that hour, but the man who walked in that night didn't take a basket, didn't look at the shelves, didn't glance at a single price sign. He wore a dark coat and walked straight past the entire line of cashiers as though they didn't exist, stopped in front of Harlan, and placed an envelope on the counter. He said the rent for that quarter was overdue, and that he had been asked to stop by and remind him, because the people on the other side didn't want to have to remind him twice. He said it in the voice of someone reading out a train schedule. Delaney was standing about 3 steps away, and she saw everything. She saw the clipboard in Harlan's hand lower. She saw his shoulders sink slightly, the way a person sits down while still standing. His voice changed before he even opened his mouth, and when he did, the voice that had been shouting at her 30 seconds earlier was completely gone, replaced by another one, softer, faster, apologizing, explaining something about the bank, about the slow season, about how he had been meaning to call. He pulled the checkbook from the drawer beneath the counter. He wrote, and Delaney saw his hand tremble. Not much, only enough that the numbers in the date came out crooked, and he had to trace over them once to make them clear. The other man took the check, folded it, slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, thanked him with exactly 2 words, then walked out. The bell rang again. No one in the store said anything. Harlan stood there staring at the door longer than necessary, then turned back, saw the entire line of cashiers still looking at him, and told them to close their registers, his voice already back to what it had been before, except this time no one heard in it what they had always heard before. Delaney pushed her cash drawer back in, locked it, and on her way toward the rear exit she passed Ezra Pike, who was restacking several boxes of canned goods. She asked him who that man had been. Ezra didn't look up. He said the whole block belonged to one family, and everyone rented, because nobody really owned anything. Then he bent down and went back to arranging his boxes. And Delaney understood that the conversation was over. But that night, when she reached the parking lot, she was still thinking about the trembling hand of the man who had made her count money in front of the entire store. And for the first time since the day she had started working there, she realized something simple she had never considered before. That her boss was afraid of someone too. Boyd's parking lot was divided into 2 clearly different sections. The front was brightly lit and regularly swept, while the back, along the chain-link fence, had only a single street lamp and 1 camera angled downward from the corner of the warehouse roof. Delaney parked in that exact spot, beneath the street lamp, within the camera's view. She had chosen it for a reason, and convenience wasn't that reason. The pickup belonged to Cal. It had died in the spring, in the middle of the drive home after a shift, and the mechanic at the repair shop at the end of the block had opened the hood, looked inside for only a moment, then named a repair price equal to roughly 3 months of rent, which by then she couldn't afford either. She thanked him, closed the hood, and from that day forward the truck never moved another inch. Someone helped tow it back to the lot, and it stayed there in the rear corner beneath the street lamp, slowly ceasing to be a vehicle, and becoming instead a metal roof with 4 walls and a door that could be locked from the inside. She moved into it one evening in May, after returning the apartment keys to the landlord and carrying away 2 bags. At night, after locking her register and signing out, she walked around to the back, opened the truck door, climbed into the rear seat, then pulled a blue tarp across the windows. She did it quickly, always after the parking lot had emptied, because there are some things a woman doesn't want anyone to see her doing. Inside the truck, everything had its proper place. Her bag of clothes sat on the floor beneath the seat. A bottle of water and a box of saltine crackers stayed in the door compartment. The flat shoes she wore to work were lined up neatly beneath the front seat, because if she left them scattered, she would have to bend down to search for them in the morning, and bending down had begun to become difficult for her. Draped over the back of the rear seat was Cal's safety jacket, the orange one with reflective strips running along both sleeves, the one his company had issued him and never asked to have returned. She covered herself with it every night. It was heavy, rough, nowhere near as warm as a proper blanket, but it was wide, and when she pulled it all the way up beneath her chin, it covered the whole of her growing belly, and somewhere inside the smell of old canvas, there still remained something faint from the man who had worn it through 4 seasons. On the steering wheel, near the 10 o'clock position, there was a small yellow note that had been stuck there since the previous winter. Cal had written it in ballpoint pen, the letters large and slanted, reminding her to take her medicine and not forget the way she had the last time. He had put it there because he knew she would sit behind the wheel every morning. The paper had curled at the edges, and the ink had faded around the final word, but she never peeled it off, and she no longer used it to remember when to take her medicine either, because she hadn't bought another refill in several weeks. Every night before sleeping, she lay on her left side because the doctor at the community clinic had told her to, pulled Cal's jacket over herself, and rested one hand on her stomach. The little girl kicked most around that time, when everything had gone quiet and only the sound of rain or cars on the main road carried in from outside. Delaney talked to her. She spoke softly, almost moving only her lips. telling her that a woman at the store had bought so many oranges that the bag had torn, that Mr. Ezra had mixed up 2 rows of canned goods again, that the weather outside was changing and it would probably rain over the weekend. She didn't tell her about counting money in the middle of the aisle. She didn't tell her about the deduction receipt. Some things she left outside the truck door with her shoes. Then she made a promise, and it was the same promise every night, that this wasn't where her daughter would grow up, that this was only temporary, that her mother was working things out. She said it with the certainty of someone trying to convince herself. The next morning, she woke before 5 o'clock, folded Cal's jacket and laid it back across the seat, pulled down the tarp, and walked around to the front of the store so she could enter through the employee door exactly like someone who had just arrived for work. No one at Boyd's knew. She had kept it hidden for almost 4 months, and she never once thought about the camera angled down from the corner of the warehouse roof. The camera she had deliberately parked within sight of, because to her it was simply the thing that watched over her while she slept. Cal Marsh worked unloading cargo at the harbor on the south side of the city, on the night shift, and he had been there so long that the gate guard no longer needed to look at his badge before raising a hand to greet him whenever he passed. He did that work for nearly 7 years. 7 winters standing in the sea wind, 7 summers in the heat rising off the concrete, and through all that time he never took more than 3 days off in a row, not even during the bout of flu that left him so sick he had to sit down in the middle of a shift. That winter night, there was fog in the air, and a thin layer of ice had formed across the dock. People said the crane in Section 14 had been overdue for inspection for a long time. Said everyone who worked there knew it, said someone had filed a written request, and that piece of paper was sitting somewhere inside a drawer. Delaney heard those things afterward, from the men who came to her home and stood in the hallway with their hats in their hands, none of them able to get through a second sentence. She remembered asking them only one question, whether he had time to call anyone. No one answered. The funeral was held on a morning when there was neither rain nor sun. Then came the part no one had prepared her for. A representative from the harbor insurance company asked her to come to the office, invited her to sit down, poured her a glass of water, and opened a file. In that file, Cal Marsh's name wasn't on the harbor's official employee list. It was on another list, the temporary labor roster of a subcontractor she had never heard of, a company name made up of 2 letters and 1 number that she had to look at twice before she could even read it. The man explained very carefully that the harbor's insurance only applied to harbor employees, and that her husband, according to the paperwork, wasn't a harbor employee. She said he had worked there for 7 years. The man nodded and said he understood, but that he could only work with the documents in front of him. She took that file to the subcontractor, and the address on the paperwork led her to a row of rental offices on the 2nd floor above a laundromat. The door was locked. The building manager told her they had moved out before Christmas. 3 weeks later, she received a letter saying the company had filed for bankruptcy, along with a list of creditors with her name near the bottom. She spoke to 2 lawyers. The first listened to her for 15 minutes, then told her plainly that the party with the money wasn't legally responsible, while the party that was responsible no longer existed, and that he didn't want to take her money for something he already knew wouldn't go anywhere. The second lawyer didn't say it quite that directly. He only asked her to come back later and never called. After that, everything moved very quickly. The savings were gone in the first month because of the funeral. In the second month, she managed to pay half the rent. In the third month, the landlord taped a notice to her door, and he wasn't a bad man. He stood in the hallway and apologized to her sincerely, but the notice was still there. She returned the keys one afternoon in early May, carrying 2 bags and the orange safety jacket draped over one arm. She applied for work at 4 places, and Boyd's was the only one that called her back because Boyd's needed someone for the night shift, and there were never enough people willing to work nights. During the interview, Harlan Boyd asked whether she had anything that might interfere with the job, and she said no. She said no, and she kept that answer unchanged through all the months that followed. She never told anyone at the store about the harbor, about the crane in Section 14, about the file where her husband's name had been placed in the wrong category. She didn't tell them because in a place where people were forced to count their own money aloud in the middle of an aisle, a story like that wouldn't be heard as grief. It would be heard as a reason to fire her. At Boyd's, the frozen food section ran along the back wall, and the floor beneath the glass freezer doors was always wet, because the rubber seal on the bottom door had been broken for a long time, and no one was willing to replace it. Cleaning that area belonged to the janitorial crew, and the janitorial crew came in on Tuesday mornings. Cashiers didn't mop floors. It was written on the duty chart posted in the break room, and everyone knew it. But that night, after the store had closed and half the lights in the sales area had been switched off, Harlan Boyd called Delaney's name over the intercom, and by the time she reached the end of the aisle, he was already standing there with a cleaning rag and a plastic bucket at his feet. He didn't mention the cash count. He didn't say anything about the deduction receipt she had signed. He only said the floor there was dirty, that he wasn't satisfied, and that she was to finish it before going home. Delaney looked at the bucket, then at him, and she didn't ask why it had to be her. She had learned that questions like that didn't have answers in this place. They only had consequences. She took off her apron, draped it over the freezer handle, and lowered herself to her knees. Kneeling with her belly wasn't a single movement anymore. It was a whole sequence of movements. She had to brace one hand against the edge of the freezer, lower one knee first, then the other, and once she was down on the floor, she understood that getting back up would be much harder. Water soaked through the knees of her pants almost immediately. The floor had the particular cold of a frozen food aisle, not the cold of winter, but a cold that seemed to rise from underneath, sinking into her kneecaps and staying there. She scrubbed. She cleaned beneath the first glass section, wrung out the rag, then moved to the second. By then, the store was so quiet that she could hear the steady hum of the freezer compressors above her. Somewhere near the far end of the aisle, Ezra Pike was still finishing the stocking for the morning shift, and she could hear cardboard boxes dragging across the floor, the sound of a box cutter. Then suddenly those sounds stopped. A little while later, he came over. He didn't say anything. He set a low wooden stool beside her, the kind the stock workers used when they needed to reach the highest shelves. And next to the stool he placed a cup of tea, a white ceramic mug with a chip missing from the rim, still steaming. Delaney looked up. She had barely opened her mouth when Harlan's voice carried down from the other end of the aisle, telling Ezra to put the stool back where it belonged, telling him this wasn't his concern, telling him he would be better off minding his own section. Ezra didn't turn around. He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He didn't even look toward the voice. He simply straightened, left the stool exactly where he had placed it, left the cup of tea beside it, then walked back the way he had come, and a few seconds later, the sound of cardboard boxes sliding across the floor resumed at the end of the aisle as though it had never stopped. Harlan remained there for a little while at the entrance to the aisle. Then he left too. Delaney stayed where she was on the wet floor, the rag still in her hand, staring at the little stool sitting about a handspan away. She finished wiping the section she had started, wrung the rag into the bucket, then braced her hands against the edge of the freezer and pulled herself upright, and she sat down on that stool. It was low, barely higher than the floor, but when she sat, the weight that had been pressing down through both knees for the past 8 hours lifted away, and she could hear the sound of her own breathing. She picked up the cup of tea with both hands. It was hot, so hot that she had to shift it from one hand to the other twice, and she held it there for a long time before taking the first sip. Then she cried. She cried without making a sound, her head bowed, both hands still wrapped around the cup, her shoulders trembling in short waves. She hadn't cried in the hallway when the men came holding their hats to tell her what had happened. She hadn't cried in the office with the file that placed her husband's name in the wrong category. She hadn't cried the day she returned the apartment keys. And she hadn't cried on the first night she slept in the truck. She sat there on that little wooden stool in the store with almost all the lights turned off, surrounded by the smell of freezers and wet flooring, and she cried until the tea in her hands had gone completely cold. The community clinic occupied the ground floor of an old building on the west side of the city, and people had to take a number early in the morning and then sit waiting for nearly the entire day. Delaney went on her day off and sat in the third row of chairs, and by the time her number was called, she had been sitting so long that both feet had swollen inside her flat shoes. The doctor was a young woman who spoke quickly and didn't waste words. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around Delaney's arm, pumped it up, looked at the reading, took it off, then repeated the measurement on the other arm. She said nothing during that second reading. Afterward, she asked Delaney to provide a urine sample, and when the results came back, she placed the paper on the desk, turned it around, and explained. She said Delaney's blood pressure was much higher than she wanted to see. She said there was protein in her urine. She said that when those two things appeared together at this stage of pregnancy, there was a name for it, and that name described something she didn't want to have to mention to Delaney a second time. She asked how many hours Delaney stood each day. Delaney said her shift was 8 hours. The doctor asked whether she was allowed to sit down. Delaney was silent for a moment before saying no. The doctor set down her pen. She said that from now on Delaney wasn't to remain standing for more than 4 hours at a time, that she needed to lie on her left side whenever possible, that she had to return within 10 days to have her blood pressure checked again and get blood tests, and that if she developed a severe headache, blurred vision, or swelling in her face, She was to go straight to the emergency room and not wait for her appointment. Then, the doctor wrote out the follow-up appointment slip, handed it to her, and Delaney took it to the clinic cashier to ask how much the return visit and laboratory tests would cost. The woman behind the counter checked the computer, then gave her a number. Delaney nodded, thanked her, folded the appointment slip in half, and put it in her wallet. Inside that wallet was the pay from the previous 2 weeks, already reduced by the amount Harlan Boyd claimed had been missing. The cost of the follow-up visit was nearly all of it. Not quite all, but close enough that what remained wouldn't cover much of anything for the next half-month. 3 days later, Harlan called her into his office. He didn't offer her a chair, and she didn't ask for one. He opened a drawer, took out the deduction receipt she had signed, placed it on the desk, and turned it toward her exactly as he had before. He said that under company policy, the shortage had to be entered into her personnel file, and he said it in the voice of someone preparing to grant another person a favor. Then he said he was a reasonable man. He said that if she paid the amount back in cash that week, he would tear up the paper. Nothing would go into her record, and no one would ever know. He let those words sit between them for a while, before adding that he was doing it because she was pregnant, and because he didn't want her applying somewhere else later with something like that written in her employment record. Delaney looked at the paper on the desk. She understood perfectly well that this wasn't kindness. She understood that he didn't need the money, that what he wanted was the satisfaction of watching her open her wallet in front of him. She told him she would give him an answer later, and he raised his eyebrows, but he let her leave. That night she sat in the truck for a long time without pulling up the tarp. She kept the clinic appointment slip on her lap, and simply sat there beneath the streetlight shining through the glass, doing the calculation she had already done in her head over and over for the past 3 days, doing it one more time to make certain, even though she knew the answer wouldn't change. If she gave the money to Harlan, the paper on her lap would become meaningless. She would miss the follow-up appointment and tell herself that she felt fine, that she would watch for the warning signs, that she would go next time. If she kept the money for the appointment, that line would remain in her employment file, and after that line appeared, she would become someone with a record at Boyd's, and anyone who had worked there long enough knew what happened to people with records. She placed one hand on her belly. The little girl was kicking. Delaney sat there until the street lamp outside flickered once and came back on, and she whispered one sentence to her unborn child, telling her that Mom was going to the doctor. Then she folded the appointment slip and put it back in her wallet, pulled up the tarp, and lay down. The next morning, she went upstairs to the office and told Harlan Boyd to put it in her file. He stared at her for a long time without saying anything, then picked up the receipt, clipped it back onto his board, and from that day forward he began watching her in an entirely different way. The weather service had been warning about the storm since the beginning of the week, and by noon that Friday the stores along the street had already begun closing early, but Harlan Boyd hadn't, because in his experience, storms were when people bought supplies, and he had told the evening shift to open and work the usual hours. That afternoon, the warehouse supervisor reported that inventory was short by 1 case of milk. At Boyd's, that wasn't a major problem. It happened once or twice every month. But Harlan wasn't the kind of man who ignored small things, and he also had his own reason for wanting to find something. He went into the back office, opened the camera software, and rewound the footage to the previous afternoon. He watched the entire morning delivery. He watched the entire unloading of the pallets. Then he fast-forwarded through the night, through the stretch when the screen showed nothing but a band of gray and a street lamp glowing in the upper left corner, and he was about to shut it off when something moved in that corner. He rewound. He zoomed in. On the screen, beside the chain-link fence at the back of the lot, a woman opened the door of the old pickup truck, looked around the parking lot once, climbed into the back seat, and pulled a tarp up over the windows. The clock in the corner of the screen showed a little after 2 o'clock in the morning. Harlan sat still. He went back one more night and saw the same thing. He went back another night, and again it was the same, except that on that night, she stood beside the truck door for a while before climbing inside. He turned off the screen. He sat there for about the length of a cigarette, and what he thought about during that time wasn't the missing case of milk, and it wasn't the fact that one of his employees had nowhere to live. What he thought about was how, for all those months, right there in his parking lot, beneath his camera, someone had been living without his knowing it, and every day she had walked around to the front of the building and entered through the employee door, like someone who had just arrived for work, and every single time, he had believed her. He picked up the phone, called the towing company at the end of the street, gave them the license plate number and the location, and said there was an unfamiliar vehicle illegally parked on store property and that he wanted it removed that afternoon. They asked whether he had any paperwork proving he had the authority to do that. He said he owned the place, and they stopped asking questions. The tow truck arrived after the rain had begun to fall lightly, and Harlan stood at the back office window watching until the pickup was lifted, until the rear of the truck disappeared beyond the parking lot gate. Then he went back to his desk, turned on the computer, and began typing. He opened the personnel file beside him and copied each line into the report. The cash shortage from Friday night that she had signed for. 2 late arrivals that month, both of them on days when she had gone to appointments at the community clinic and had notified them in advance, but on a written report, whether she had given notice or not, still became the same single line. Use of company property for purposes unrelated to employment. And he typed that sentence very slowly, choosing each word. He left the final section blank. He printed 2 copies, clipped them to the clipboard, and put the board beneath the customer service counter. Then he went out onto the sales floor, walked his usual round, spoke to a few customers, straightened a stack of boxes. By early evening, the rain had grown heavier. The night shift came in. Harlan said nothing to anyone. He stayed near the customer service counter almost the entire evening, and he didn't leave that spot. And every time Delaney looked toward him, he was looking somewhere else. He waited. He waited until the last rush of customers had passed. Waited until only a few people remained in the store, and closing time was near. Waited until that exact moment at the end of the shift, when the cashiers began cleaning their registers and carrying the trays of unsold baked goods toward the discard bins in the back. And he remained standing there watching her, one hand resting on the clipboard, holding 2 copies of the report with one final section still left blank. Delaney had gone about 1 block before she could no longer tell where the curb ended. Water poured down from the slope in a steady stream along the drainage channel, and the channel had overflowed long ago, so the street and sidewalk had blended into one sheet of murky water, shimmering beneath the traffic light, flashing yellow at the intersection. She walked in the middle of the road because there was less debris floating there. No cars passed. The whole neighborhood had gone dark early, with only a few forgotten signs still glowing, and someone's porch light striking her eyes every time the wind gusted. She passed the laundromat with its metal shutter pulled down. She passed the small church with stone steps, where the water had already risen to the 2nd step. Her flat shoes had been soaked through from the very first step, and now every stride made a wet squelching sound inside them, and her feet were so cold she could no longer feel that they belonged to her. By the 2nd intersection, she had to stop. There was a bus shelter there, its clear plastic roof yellowed with age, with a metal bench divided into 3 seats, and she staggered beneath it, gripped the side of the bench, then sat down. Water ran from her hair down along her spine. She sat there breathing, and while she was trying to breathe, the pain came. It wasn't like the contractions she had grown used to over the past several weeks. This one began beneath her lower back, tightened around toward the front, then squeezed, and it held on so long that she had to bend forward around her belly and stop breathing while she waited for it to pass. When it finally released her, her ears were ringing, and tiny points of light drifted across her vision, disappeared, then returned. She remembered the young doctor at the clinic, remembered the way the woman had set her pen down on the desk when she gave that warning. Delaney reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen still lit up, and there was more than a quarter of the battery left. She called emergency services. Someone answered, a calm woman's voice asking where she was and what was happening. Delaney gave the name of the intersection. She said she was 7 months pregnant, said her blood pressure was high, said her doctor had told her that if she started seeing spots, she needed to go straight to the emergency room. She heard a keyboard clicking on the other end of the line. Then the woman, still speaking in that same calm tone, said that roads all over the city were flooding, that ambulances were tied up on the east side, that they would log her call and send someone as soon as they could, but that the wait tonight was extremely long. Delaney asked how long. The woman paused for a moment and said she couldn't promise. She told Delaney to lie on her left side, not to keep walking, and to keep the phone with her. Delaney said thank you. She meant it, without any bitterness, because she understood that the woman on the other end was doing everything she could on a night when no one could do very much. Then she ended the call, and she remained alone in that bus shelter beneath the rain, hammering against the plastic roof, as though someone far above were endlessly pouring stones down onto it. She lay on her left side across the bench, drawing her legs up because it was too short, and placed both hands over her belly. The little girl wasn't kicking. Delaney waited, and she kept talking, because she had talked to her child every night for months, and she wasn't going to let tonight be the exception. She said, "Mom is sorry." She said, "Mom promised you that place was only temporary. Mom promised she was getting things worked out. And Mom thought she only needed to keep going for a few more weeks." She said Mom went to the doctor. You know, Mom chose to go to the doctor. And Mom thought that meant she had done the right thing. But it turns out doing the right thing doesn't always save you. She said your father was the kindest man Mom had ever known, and he would never have let the two of us end up sitting somewhere like this. And Mom is sorry you won't get to know him. She said Mom is asking you for only one thing. Don't go now. Wait for me. I haven't found you a decent place to come into the world yet. But I will. I just need you to wait for me a little longer. Then the pain came again, and this time she couldn't speak through it. She gripped the edge of the metal bench, closed her eyes, and when it passed, she lay completely still, breathing shallowly, watching the puddle beneath the shelter ripple into small circles under the rain. She had no idea how long she had been lying there. She only knew that at some point, a beam of light swept across the roof of the shelter, slowed, and then stopped. The car stopped a few steps from the bus shelter, a black sedan, and it didn't pull over in a hurry. It came to a slow, deliberate stop, its two red taillights spilling across the floodwater. Delaney pushed herself upright. She sat up faster than her body could manage and had to grip the edge of the bench for a while until the dizziness passed. But she still forced herself to sit straight, because there was only one thought in her mind then, that she was a woman alone in the middle of the night, on a street where no one else was left, and a car had just stopped. She had heard enough stories to know how nights like this could turn. She reached into her coat pocket for her phone and closed her hand tightly around it. The rear door on the right opened first. The man who stepped out was older, with salt and pepper hair, and he didn't walk directly toward her. He stopped some distance from the shelter and stood in the rain without covering himself, both hands hanging at his sides, and stayed exactly where he was. He didn't say anything. He simply stood there. And the way he chose that exact distance and didn't take another step made Delaney realize that he knew she was afraid and was deliberately letting her see that he wasn't coming any closer. Then the door on the other side opened. A second man stepped out, and she heard water splash beneath his shoes before she could make out his face. He was much younger than the first man, tall, wearing a dark coat, and he walked around the front of the car toward the shelter, then stopped too, only a little closer. He looked at her. He looked at both hands resting over her belly, at the puddle gathered beneath the bench, at her shoes, and she watched his gaze travel over all of it before coming to rest. He took off his coat. Delaney drew back instinctively, but he didn't move any closer. He took one step, laid the coat over her shoulders, and his hands didn't touch her. They didn't touch her shoulders, didn't touch her hair, didn't touch her anywhere. Then he stepped half a pace back. The coat still held the warmth of the person who had been wearing it, and that warmth reached her so suddenly that a hard shiver ran through her entire body. She said she was fine. She said it in a voice that even she knew no one would believe. He didn't answer that. He asked whether she had called emergency services. She said she had, and that they had told her the ambulances were tied up. He gave one small nod. He didn't ask where she had come from. He didn't ask why a pregnant woman was sitting alone in a bus shelter at that hour on a night like this. He didn't ask who had done what to her. And later, whenever Delaney thought back to that night, she still believed that was the kindest thing he had done for her. The fact that he didn't ask. He turned his head and called the older man by name. He told him to bring the car closer. The man moved immediately, backing the sedan up several yards before pulling it right alongside the shelter. The rear door already open. The younger man looked at her again. He asked whether she could stand. Delaney tried. She braced one hand against the bench, pushed herself up, and had only made it halfway when her left knee gave way. He held out one arm, bent at the elbow, his forearm turned upward, and he simply left it there without saying anything else, without pulling her, without taking hold of her, only leaving it there for her. Delaney looked at that arm for a second. Then she placed her hand on it and pulled herself upright. They made their way slowly to the car, water reaching their ankles, while the older man stood holding the door. Once she was seated in the back, the younger man bent down, closed the door, walked around to the other side, and sat in the same row with her, but at the far end beside the opposite door, leaving an empty space between them. The older man got behind the wheel. The younger man said the central hospital. He said the emergency entrance. The car moved. Delaney leaned against the door, with the coat still wrapped around her shoulders, both hands resting on her belly, and watched the streetlights outside slide past the window in blurred streaks of light through the rain. At one point she turned toward him, meaning to ask his name. He was staring straight ahead, one hand resting against his knee, and she saw his jaw tighten once, very quickly, then release. She didn't ask. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in many hours, she allowed herself to stop holding everything together. At the emergency entrance, someone brought out a wheelchair before Delaney even had time to open the car door. And from that moment on, everything happened faster than she could follow. Someone took her blood pressure right there in the hallway, then called a number loudly toward the nurse's station. And the way that number was called made two nurses standing behind the desk look up at the same time. They wheeled her through two sets of doors. Someone inserted a needle into the back of her hand, strapped a monitor across her belly, and then the sound of a heartbeat filled the room, fast and steady. And the moment Delaney heard it, she began to cry without even understanding why. Someone asked when she had eaten last. She couldn't remember. Then medication began flowing into her arm, and the ceiling started drifting away. The doctor on duty that night was a man well past middle age, and when he stepped into the hallway, all he saw were two men waiting there, the older one leaning against the wall, the younger one standing straight with his hands in his pockets. He asked which of them was family. The younger man said neither of them was, then added that he was the one who had brought her in. The doctor studied him for a moment, then spoke plainly, the way a man speaks when he is too tired to waste words. He said her blood pressure had been at a dangerous level. He said that if she had remained outside for another few hours, they might have lost both mother and child that night, and he put particular weight on the word both. Then he said she would need to remain in the hospital for observation for at least several days, and he asked who would be responsible for the cost. The younger man didn't answer immediately. He walked to the far end of the hallway, where a window looked down over the parking lot, took out his phone, and made a call. It was a short call. The doctor, standing at the other end of the corridor, heard only the final 3 words, and those 3 words were a name. Then the man hung up, came back, and told him the administration office would have the necessary paperwork within half an hour. He didn't explain further. The doctor nodded and walked away. Delaney woke sometime near dawn. The room held nothing but the steady ticking of a monitor, while pale blue light from the screen washed across the wall. Before doing anything else, she reached down and placed a hand on her belly. The little girl kicked. Delaney lay perfectly still for a long time, eyes fixed on the ceiling, letting tears slide down both sides of her temples without wiping them away. Around noon that day, an administrative employee brought in a form for her to sign. Delaney picked it up and immediately searched for the line about cost, because that was the only thing she was truly afraid of. Under method of payment, someone had already filled it in, and the line stated that the patient had been admitted under assistance from the Giuseppina Fund. She asked the employee what that fund was. The woman shrugged and said it had existed at the hospital for a very long time, from before she had even started working there, and that it was used for cases without insurance. Delaney looked at the name for another moment. She had never heard it before. Then she signed, handed the paper back, and didn't think about it again. On the day she was discharged, the man who had brought her to the hospital appeared in the hallway, wearing the same coat, and he told her she couldn't go back to where she had been staying. Delaney said she didn't have anywhere else to go. He said she did now. The car didn't take her to a house. It stopped in front of a bakery on a corner in Federal Hill, a place that opened at 4 o'clock in the morning, and at that hour sent the smell of baking dough all the way out onto the sidewalk. And he led her around to a side entrance, up a narrow wooden staircase, and onto the 3rd floor. The door opened before he had time to knock. The woman standing in the doorway looked to be in her early 60s, her hair tied up, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, and she looked Delaney over once from head to toe before stepping aside to let her in. Her name was Teodora. She lived there. She looked after the place, and throughout that entire afternoon, she was the only person who called the man by his first name, without putting any title before it. The apartment had 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a window overlooking the bakery roof. He didn't step farther than the threshold. He stood there, said a few words to Teodora in a language Delaney didn't understand, then turned to her and said she could stay there until she recovered. Delaney asked what he wanted from her. He looked at her for a while, then said they could talk about that later, and that for now she should rest. Then he went down the stairs, and she heard the side door close below, and she realized she still didn't know his name. His name was Emilio Vitale, and Delaney learned that on her 4th day in the apartment above the bakery, not because he told her, but because Teodora mentioned it while washing dishes as though everyone was supposed to know. The next morning, he knocked on the door and told her she had a follow-up appointment that day, and that he had business to handle at the harbor first, so she would ride with him, and he would take her straight to the hospital afterward. The car stopped in front of a row of low office buildings at the edge of the docks, where shipping containers were stacked in rows and trucks stood parked along the fence. Gio Falcone turned off the engine, got out, and went in ahead of them. Emilio told her to stay in the car, said it wouldn't take long. He closed the car door but didn't shut it all the way, leaving a narrow gap, and the office was right there, its window open, only about 3 steps from where the car was parked. Delaney heard everything. She heard a chair scrape across the floor. She heard another man's voice first, high and quick, talking about contracts, delayed payments, about how everyone was struggling this season. Then the voice stopped, and she heard papers being placed on a desk. Emilio spoke. His voice wasn't any louder than when he had spoken to her on the staircase, wasn't any faster, and there wasn't a single harsh word in it. He said these were the 3 companies the other man had opened over the past 2 years, and he read each name aloud, one at a time, and after every name, the silence on the other side grew a little longer. He said these were the statements showing the money that had been moved through those 3 companies. Then he said he didn't care about either of those things. He said it very clearly, that where the man's money went was his own business. Then another sheet of paper was set down, and Emilio said this was the list of people working for him at this harbor, and the people on that list belonged to this neighborhood. He said their families lived here. He said their children went to school on Atwell Street. Then he said they would be paid on Monday, and if they weren't paid on Monday, then on Tuesday he would stand at the harbor gate and read those 3 company names aloud to them. He said the man didn't need to be afraid of him. He said he would be better off thinking about the 40 people on that list. After that came a silence so long that Delaney could hear a truck starting somewhere on the other side of the yard. Then came the sound of a pen, the sound of paper sliding across the desk, another chair scraping back, and then the other man saying thank you, saying it 2 or 3 times in a row. His voice completely changed now, soft and quick and nervous. Exactly the voice Delaney had heard once at the checkout counter at Boyd's, when someone had come to remind Harlan about the rent. She sat perfectly still in the car, with both hands resting on her belly, and realized that her heart was beating faster. Emilio came out, opened the door, and got in. He handed the papers to Gio, said a few words about sending copies to someone, then fell silent. After they had driven a while, Delaney turned toward him. She asked whether he would ever speak to her the way he had just spoken to that man. He didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window for a while, then said that he spoke to people in the way they themselves had chosen to be spoken to. He said that man had been given nearly a year to listen another way. Then he stopped, and he didn't say anything else until they reached the hospital. Delaney sat looking down at her hands. The answer didn't reassure her at all, and she understood that it hadn't been meant to. That night she couldn't sleep. She went downstairs to the kitchen for water, and the light was on. Emilio was sitting at the table, his coat draped over the back of a chair, a cup of coffee in front of him that looked as though it had gone cold a long time ago. He didn't seem surprised to see her. She poured herself some water and meant to go back upstairs, but then she stopped in the doorway and asked whether he ever slept. He said not much. She asked why. He was silent for a while, then said that everyone in this neighborhood greeted him by lowering their head. He said people lowered their heads, called him by his title, said yes before he had even finished speaking. Then he said what that meant. And he said it in the voice of a man who had thought about it many times on nights like this one. He said it meant there would be no one to tell him when he was wrong. Delaney stood in the kitchen doorway with the glass of water still in her hand. Then I will, she said. She didn't say it loudly or defiantly. She simply said it as though it were a fact. Emilio looked up at her, and he looked at her much longer than he ever had before. Then he said that if that was true, she would be the first person in many years. The little girl arrived a few weeks earlier than expected, on an evening near the end of the month, and everything went more smoothly than anything Delaney had feared. Teodora was the first to realize it, when Delaney stood up from her chair in the kitchen and then sat back down again, and she didn't ask a single question. She only reached for the bag that had been packed and waiting in the corner of the cupboard for the past 2 weeks and called downstairs. At the hospital, they took Delaney in immediately, because her records were already there from the previous visit, and the staff knew what they needed to watch. Her blood pressure was checked constantly throughout the night. Delaney held Teodora's hand for most of it, and the older woman let her squeeze so hard that her fingers turned red without pulling away. Near dawn, the little girl was born, and her first cry filled the room, thin and angry and alive, and Delaney began crying with her. They cleaned the baby, weighed her, measured her, then placed her on Delaney's chest, and the doctor said she was a little smaller than average because she had come early, but she was healthy, breathing well, able to nurse, and would only need to stay under observation for a few days before going home. Delaney looked down. The little girl had hair, dark and soft and damp against her forehead, and one tiny hand slipped out from the blanket and closed around the edge of her mother's gown. Out in the hallway, Emilio stood there through the entire night. He had come as soon as Teodora called, and he stayed against the stretch of wall between two doors, beside several plastic chairs that he never sat in even once. A nurse passing by asked whether he needed anything. He said no. Gio stayed with him for about an hour before Emilio told him to go home. When the cry came from inside the room, someone saw Emilio lift one hand and brace it against the wall for a moment, very quickly, then lower it again. Someone came out and told him that both mother and baby were safe. He nodded, said thank you, and didn't go in. He didn't go in then, and he didn't go in at any point the following morning. It wasn't until the afternoon, after Delaney had been moved to a regular room and was sitting propped against the pillows, that he finally appeared in the doorway, and even then he only stood there with his hands in his pockets, not crossing the threshold. Teodora had to turn around and tell him to come in, tell him the doorway wasn't going to bite him. He stepped inside, stopped some distance from the bed, looked at the bundle in Delaney's arms, then asked how the baby was doing. She said she was healthy. He nodded. He asked whether she had chosen a name. Delaney looked down at her daughter for a long time before saying that she had named her June. She went on to say she had chosen it because that was the month her husband had been born, and because it was a light name, a name that sounded like summer, and she wanted her daughter to have something light from the very beginning because nothing about the past few months had been light at all. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Teodora, who was folding several towels at the foot of the bed, looked up and said that was also the name of his mother. Delaney turned toward her. Teodora continued in the same calm voice she might have used to talk about the weather, saying that the woman's real name had been Giuseppina, but no one in the neighborhood had ever called her that. People had called her June since she was young, and by the time she died there were people in Federal Hill who didn't even know she had another name. Delaney turned back toward Emilio. He was standing perfectly still. He didn't say anything. He looked at the bundle in her arms for a while longer, then said excuse me, turned, and walked out into the hallway. Teodora didn't follow him. She only kept folding the towels, and after a while she said quietly, almost to herself, that she knew exactly what she was doing when she said it. Delaney sat there in the room holding her daughter, listening to the sound of footsteps fading down the hallway and then stopping somewhere, and she lowered her eyes to the little girl's sleeping face, to the tiny mouth moving faintly in her sleep, and she still didn't understand why the name she had just chosen had made a man like that walk out of the room. About 10 minutes later, he came back. His eyes looked the same. His face looked the same. He only said one thing, that it was a good name. Then he asked Teodora what else she needed to buy for the mother and the baby. There were things in the Vitali family that were done not because anyone gave an order, but because that was simply how they had always been done. And one of those things was that anyone who stayed too long in a place belonging to the family was looked into. Gio Falcone did it the way he had done it for years, without asking and without warning anyone first. It took him about a week. Then one morning he placed a stack of papers in a gray folder on Emilio's desk and said there was something he ought to see. Emilio opened it. The first page was Delaney Marsh's tax return and rental records. Ordinary, nothing remarkable. The second was her husband's death certificate. Emilio read down to the line listing the location, and he stopped there. The paper said Cargo Dock 14. He looked up at Gio. Gio said nothing, only tilted his chin toward the file, telling him without words that there was more. Emilio turned the page. There was an incident report. There was a report from the Occupational Safety Agency stating that the lifting equipment in that section had been overdue for inspection, and that a written request concerning it had already been submitted beforehand. There was a copy of the Harbor Insurance Company's denial letter, and in that letter they wrote very plainly that the victim wasn't listed as a harbor employee. There was a roster of temporary laborers belonging to a subcontractor whose name consisted of 2 letters and 1 number, and near the bottom of the page was the name Cal Marsh. There were bankruptcy papers for that subcontractor, filed only a few weeks after the funeral. Emilio sat with the file for a very long time. Dock 14 stood on land his family had controlled since the previous generation, and every lease connected to it passed across his desk. He called the harbor manager and told him to bring up every original shift record from the previous winter. The originals, not reprinted copies. That afternoon, 3 cardboard boxes were delivered. He sent word for Gio to come back to the house, but Gio was out of town, so that night Emilio sat alone in his office with the 3 boxes. He started at the beginning of the season. In the records from October, November, and December, Cal Marsh's name appeared consistently in the column for harbor workers, night shift, Same crew, same supervisor's signature at the bottom of every page. Emilio turned to the week of the accident. That page existed in two versions. The first was the supervisor's handwritten original, and in it Cal Marsh's name remained in the same column as before. The second was the typed version submitted afterward, and in that one his name had been moved into the temporary labor column beside the code belonging to that subcontractor. The entry date was 3 days after the accident. In the lower right corner of the typed version was an approval signature, and Emilio knew that signature before he even bent closer to make certain. He had seen it on thousands of documents. He had seen it on the first paper he had ever signed as head of the family, directly beneath his own signature, because he had been young then, and people had wanted one more name there for certainty. Emilio placed the two sheets side by side on the desk. He didn't call anyone. He didn't get up. He sat there beneath the desk lamp, its light falling over both pages, and the difference between them was only one word. Then he reached for the gray folder from that morning, opened it to the death certificate, and placed it beside the other two pages. He remained like that until nearly dawn. At one point he picked up his phone, lit the screen, then turned it face down on the desk again. At another point he stood and walked to the window, stayed there for a while, then came back and sat in the same chair. On the wall behind him was an old photograph of a row of streets, and he didn't look at it once. Near dawn, he placed the 3 documents into a separate folder, clipped them together, and put them into the upper drawer on the right, the drawer with a lock. He locked it. Then he called the harbor manager and asked which men from that night crew were still working there now. The man read him 3 names. Emilio wrote them down, thanked him, and ended the call. After that, he dialed Gio Falcone. Gio answered on the second ring, his voice still heavy with sleep, asking what was wrong and why he was calling so early. Emilio told him to come back. Gio asked where. Emilio said home, today, and he said it in exactly the same voice he had used with the man for all those years. Not a single word heavier than usual. Then he ended the call first. Gio Falcone arrived at noon that day, and he entered the room the way he had for all those years, without knocking, pulling out the chair and sitting down before anyone invited him to. Emilio opened the drawer, took out the folder, and placed the 2 sheets of paper on the desk, side by side, the handwritten version on the left, the typed version on the right. Gio looked down. He looked for a long time, and during that time his face didn't change. Then he sat straighter and said he wasn't going to deny it. Emilio asked why. Gio said because of the harbor lease that year. He said that if the insurance company had to pay out on a fatality, the entire safety record of the harbor would be opened, and if the safety record was opened, the tenant would pull out, and if the tenant pulled out, the 2 rows of warehouses over there would shut down. He said you had only been sitting in this chair for a few years, while I had been keeping it from wobbling since before you understood how heavy it was. He said people die at harbors all along this coast, every year, and people still have to go back to work the next morning. He said I weighed it, and I weighed it the way a man does when he has been doing this longer than you have. Emilio let him finish. Then he asked one question. How many people in those 2 rows of warehouses knew what Gio had just done for them? Gio didn't answer. Emilio said you didn't protect 2 rows of warehouses. He said you protected 1 signature, and that signature was yours. He said if you had truly weighed it, you would have come up here and told me on the day you made that choice. You wouldn't have waited until today, when someone else put the papers on my desk. Gio sat in silence. He raised one hand and rubbed his face once, and it was the only gesture he made during the entire conversation that belonged to an old man. 3 days later, Emilio summoned the heads of the branches to the restaurant at the end of Atwell's Street, the place they still used for matters like this. 7 men came. They sat around the long table. There was coffee, and no one touched it. Gio sat where he had always sat, at Emilio's right hand, and no one told him to move. Emilio gave no opening remarks. He took out the 2 sheets of paper, placed them on the table, and read them aloud. He read the handwritten version first, including the date, the supervisor's name, and the column listing Cal Marsh as a harbor employee. Then he read the typed version, the entry date, the altered column, the subcontractor code. Then he read the name of the person who had approved it. He read that name in exactly the same voice he had used for everything before it, without emphasis, without pausing, and somewhere in the room someone set down a coffee cup a little too hard, then nothing. Emilio said that in this family, a man could lose. He could lose money. He could make the wrong calculation. What he couldn't do was alter paperwork so that a family was denied something they had every right to receive. Then he gave his decision, and he gave it as plainly as though he were reading a clause in a contract. From this day forward, Gio Falcone would not represent this family in any matter. He would not sign, would not put his name on anything, would not speak on its behalf, would not appear anywhere as a man of the Vitali family. Emilio said Gio would keep everything that already belonged to him. No one would touch any of it. And he said that so the 7 men around the table would understand that this wasn't about money. Then he pushed another set of papers toward Gio and said he would sign this. It was a compensation agreement in Gio's own name, payable to Calmarsh's heir, and the money would come from him personally, not from any family fund. Gio picked up the pen. He signed in front of all 7 men. His handwriting was unchanged, the same signature Emilio had seen thousands of times. Then Emilio gave the final condition. And it was that condition that made the entire table go completely still. He said Gio would sit across from her. He said Gio would tell her himself, with his own mouth, through no intermediary, through no document, with no one there to speak for him. Gio looked up. He looked at Emilio, and for the first time that afternoon he said something that wasn't meant to defend himself. He asked when. Emilio said tomorrow. The other 7 men stood and left one by one, and none of them shook Gio's hand, not because anyone had ordered them not to, but because at that table, people knew when they shouldn't. Gio remained seated after everyone else had gone. He straightened the papers he had just signed, pushed them toward the middle of the table, then stood. For a while he remained there with one hand resting on the back of the chair at Emilio's right. The chair he had occupied since the man at the head of the table had still been a boy too small to reach the tabletop. Then he walked out. Gio Falcone came to the bakery the following morning, earlier than the agreed time, and he didn't go upstairs. He sat at the small table beside the downstairs window, ordered a cup of coffee, and when Delaney came down, he stood and pulled out the chair for her. He waited until she sat before sitting himself. He said he had come to tell her something she should have been told a long time ago. He didn't circle around it. He said her husband had died at Dock 14, and Dock 14 stood on land the Vitali family had controlled since the previous generation. He said every lease connected to that place passed across the desk of the man who had brought her here. Then he told her his part. He said that 3 days after the accident, someone had re-entered the shift record and moved her husband's name from the harbor employee column to the temporary labor column of a subcontractor, and he said the person who approved that altered entry was him. He said he had done it to preserve a lease. He didn't apologize. He said he had signed a compensation agreement the day before, and the money would be paid to her. Then he pushed a copy across the table for her to keep. Delaney looked at the paper without picking it up. She asked him only one question: how long Emilio had known. Gio said less than 2 weeks. He added that Emilio had found it himself, that no one had told him. Then he fell silent, and he remained there a while longer than necessary, long enough for Delaney to understand that he was waiting to see what she would do. He thanked her for listening, then stood and left. Delaney remained by the window, Gio's coffee untouched. Not a single sip taken from it. She went upstairs sometime in the middle of the morning and began packing. She did it slowly and in order, putting the baby's clothes into one bag and her own things into the other. Then she called the shop at the end of the street, the place that had remained closed and quiet, and that Emilio had taken her to see twice before, and asked the person holding the keys whether the room in the back was still usable. Early that afternoon, she walked down there with Teodora. The 2 women cleaned the room for more than 2 hours. They scrubbed the floor, wiped the windows, moved the single bed against the inside wall, switched on the electric heater ahead of time so the room would be warm, and Teodora was the one who insisted on testing the outlet twice before she would allow the crib to be placed in the corner. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon before the room was warm and the crib had been made, and only then did they go back to the bakery to get the baby. June was fed until she was full, wrapped carefully, and Teodora carried her for the entire short walk, while Delaney carried the 2 bags. It was still daylight. The little girl slept the whole way, and when they placed her in the crib, she only shifted once before falling back asleep. Delaney stood looking at her for a while, then turned, walked back to the bakery one last time, and placed the apartment keys on the kitchen table where they couldn't be missed. Emilio arrived when evening was beginning to settle in. He didn't call ahead. She heard the side door downstairs, then his footsteps on the wooden stairs, and he stopped at the threshold as he always did, looking at the empty place where the 2 bags had been, then at the keys on the table. Delaney stood in the middle of the kitchen and said she knew. He nodded. He didn't ask who had told her. He didn't say another word about the harbor, about the paperwork, about the 3 days after the accident, and later, when she thought back on that afternoon, she realized there were many things he could have said, and that he had chosen to say none of them. He stood there and told her the part she didn't know. He said the shop at the end of the street had already been transferred into her name. He said the paperwork had been completed while she was still in the hospital, before the baby was even born, and that it had already been filed with the city. He said she wasn't renting it, wasn't borrowing it, and didn't owe anyone a single day's work for it. Then he took an envelope from his coat pocket, placed it on the table beside the keys, and said it contained copies of the documents and the name of the person at the notary's office if she wanted to verify anything herself. Delaney looked at the envelope. She asked why he hadn't told her. He was silent for a while, then said that if he had told her, she wouldn't have accepted it. He said now she couldn't refuse it even if she wanted to, because her name was already on it. She stood still. There were many things she wanted to say, and she didn't say any of them. Emilio looked at her a little longer, then told her to take care of herself. And he said those ordinary words in the voice of a man who knew he wouldn't be given another chance to say them. Then he turned and walked out. His footsteps went down the wooden stairs. The side door closed below. And after that, on the third floor, there was only Delaney, the keys, and the envelope resting on the kitchen table. The shop at the end of the street had been closed for so long that the layer of dust on the front windows was thick enough to write in. And during the first week, Delaney did nothing but clean. She scraped the old paper coverings from the glass, tore out 2 rows of shelves that had rotted through, scrubbed the floor with a brush and hot water, and every time the baby woke, she stopped where she was, went into the back room, fed her, then came out and started again. The first person she called wasn't anyone she knew well. It was Ezra Pike. And when she called, she learned that he had quit Boyd's the week after the storm, without giving anyone a reason, simply placing his employee badge on the desk and walking out. When he finished listening to her, he asked what time she wanted him there. He came the next day with his own box cutter, and for 3 straight weeks the two of them rebuilt that place from 4 empty walls. The store opened on a Tuesday morning with no large sign and no flowers, only a small wooden board on which Ezra had repainted the lettering, and the name on it was June's Market. Behind the counter, where only the people working inside could read it, Delaney nailed up a piece of cardboard with 2 handwritten lines. The first said that no one here would ever be made to count their own money in front of other people. The second said that no one would leave through this door in the middle of a storm. Trouble started in the 3rd week. The largest distributor in the region, the company that supplied milk and frozen goods to most of the stores in the neighborhood, sent her a brief letter saying they were temporarily suspending deliveries until they finished reviewing her partner records. Delaney called, and the person on the other end spent 10 minutes talking around the subject before finally saying that people had heard things about where the money for her store had come from. 3 days later, the first inspection team arrived. 4 days after that, came a second team from a different department, then a third, all within the same 2 weeks. Ezra heard from an old acquaintance who still worked at Boyd's that Harlan Boyd had lately been spending time at the coffee shop at the end of the street, telling anyone willing to listen that the store down the block had been opened with dirty money, that no one built a business like that on a cashier's wages. Delaney listened and said nothing. She didn't call Emilio. She didn't send him a message. She opened the filing cabinet, took everything out, and when the inspectors arrived for the 3rd time, she laid all of it across the counter before they had a chance to ask. She gave them the deed transfer stamped by the city, the notarized documents, the bank records from the day the store opened, invoices for every single case of goods, Ezra's payroll records, permits, tax receipts. She told them they could sit there as long as they needed, that if they wanted copies, she would print them, and that she didn't have a single page to hide. The lead inspector sat at the small table in the back room for most of that afternoon, and when he came out, he thanked her, then stopped at the door and said one thing that wasn't part of his job, that she shouldn't let things like this wear her down. As for the merchandise, she found her own way. She went looking for small vegetable growers and egg farms outside the city, places the big chains ignored because their supply was too small to bother contracting with, and within 2 weeks, she had signed enough agreements to fill 2 entire rows of shelves. Around the same time, on the other side of the city, someone came to Emilio Vitale and explained that the distributor rented 3 warehouses on family land, that one phone call would settle the matter, and that the inspection departments wouldn't be difficult either. Emilio listened to everything. Then he said no. The man thought he had misheard and asked again. Emilio said anyone who stepped through that door would be stepping through him, and he said it clearly enough that no one could misunderstand. Then he said no one was to go inside and help. He said she didn't need them to win it for her. The man left with the expression of someone who didn't understand. And in the Vitale family, a man's failure to understand didn't change anything. On several evenings during those 2 weeks, the black sedan parked across the street near the end of the block, about 1 row of buildings away from June's Market. its lights turned off. Emilio sat inside. From there, he could see the warm yellow light spilling onto the sidewalk. See the shadow of an older man carrying boxes past the front window. See a woman standing behind the register ringing up customers, bending down, standing up, bending down again. He stayed about half an hour each time. He didn't get out of the car. He didn't call. Then he told the driver to go. By the end of the second week, the distributor sent a letter saying the review was complete and they were prepared to resume deliveries. Delaney read the letter while standing behind the counter, folded it, put it in a drawer, and didn't answer that day. She waited until the end of the week before replying, and in her letter she said she would still buy from them, but only part of what she used to, because someone else was already supplying the rest. Just when it seemed the matter was over, another letter arrived the following month. This time it came from the bank, where Delaney had applied for a small loan to replace the refrigeration system. And the letter stated that because information had been reported regarding the origin of the property, the store would need to provide additional documentation proving that the transfer had been lawful and free of any dispute. Ezra told her to leave it alone, to do whatever else she wanted but not start digging any deeper. Delaney said that if she didn't dig, then every few months someone else would do the digging for her. She went to the city's public records archive on a Thursday morning, filled out a request form, and in the section asking for the scope of the search, she wrote that she wanted every public record connected to the Vitali name from the previous 3 years. The woman behind the counter looked at the form, raised an eyebrow, then said there was a lot of material under that name, and asked whether she was certain she wanted all of it. Delaney said she was. They told her to wait, and she sat in the hallway for nearly 2 hours with her bag held on her lap, glancing at the clock from time to time, because she needed to be back by noon to relieve Ezra. The stack of papers they brought out was thicker than she had expected. She signed for it, paid the copying fee, and intended to take it straight back to the store. But then she sat down again on the bench in the hallway and opened it right there, because she wanted to know in advance whether there was anything inside that she needed to be afraid of. She went through the pages quickly. Building permits, changes of use, rental registrations, transfers of ownership, mostly street names she recognized and official stamps she didn't understand. She found the transfer documents for her own store about halfway through the stack, read them twice, and everything was exactly as he had told her. She let out a breath. Then she kept turning pages, because she had paid for the whole file, and she intended to read the whole file. Near the end, tucked between 2 renovation permits, there was a document unlike all the others. It wasn't a city form. It was a copy of a petition submitted to the State Occupational Safety Agency, requesting that the investigation into a lifting equipment accident at Cargo Dock 14 be reopened, accompanied by a list of similar equipment still operating in that area, and a request that every one of those units be re-inspected. At the bottom of the page was a signature, and beneath the signature was the name Emilio Vitali. Delaney started again from the beginning. She read more slowly this time, one word at a time, making certain she hadn't misunderstood anything. Then she looked for the date. The filing date was stamped in the upper right corner with the receiving agency's mark, the ink already slightly faded. She stared at that date, and she went still. She opened her bag, took out her wallet, and inside it she still kept the hospital discharge paper folded into quarters from that night at the Central Hospital, because it contained several lines of the doctor's instructions she hadn't yet memorized. She unfolded it, smoothed it across her lap, and placed the 2 papers side by side. The petition had been filed 7 months before that night. 7 months before the night she had been sitting alone in the bus shelter. 7 months before he knew who she was. Before he knew her name. Before there was any reason in the world for him to have done such a thing because of her. Delaney sat down. She was already sitting, but she still felt as though she had just fallen into the seat, the feeling of someone who has suddenly had something taken away that had been holding her upright for months without her even knowing it was there. The hallway was filled with the sound of people lining up at the counter across the room, the hum of the photocopier, someone calling out a number. She heard none of it. She sat there with the 2 papers across her lap and thought about that afternoon in the apartment above the bakery. Thought about how he had stood in the doorway and could have told her this with a single sentence, just one sentence, and had chosen not to. She thought about how, if he had told her that day, she would have stayed, and she understood immediately that this was exactly why he hadn't said it. She remained there so long that the woman from the counter finally came over and asked whether she was all right. Delaney said she was fine. She folded the discharge paper again and put it back into her wallet, but she didn't return the petition to the stack. She carried it separately in her hand all the way to the door. Outside, the sun was shining. She stood on the archive building steps for a while with the paper still in her hand, looking down the sloping street toward Federal Hill, a neighborhood she hadn't passed through since the day she had returned the keys. Then she slipped the petition into her bag, walked to the bus stop, and went back to the store in time to relieve Ezra. That stormy night did more than take a cashier away from Harlan Boyd. Water poured into the cold storage room through the very door whose seal he had kept meaning to replace, and everything frozen inside spoiled within 2 days. He called the insurance company, and after checking the policy, they told him that flood damage coverage had been removed at his own request 2 renewal periods earlier, so he could lower the premium. He stood in the middle of that soaked storage room listening to those words, and couldn't think of anything to say. Then spring came, and with it a letter from the State Labor Department. Ezra Pike and 3 other former employees of Boyd's had filed complaints about wages being deducted, detailed complaints accompanied by copies of the receipts they had been forced to sign in the middle of the aisle on Friday nights for all those years. The inspectors went back through the payroll records from the beginning, and the amount of back pay, combined with the penalties, was greater than anything Harlan could still find a way to cover. Suppliers cut off his credit terms when his credit profile deteriorated. The store held on through 1 more summer, then closed. Cheryl lost her health insurance at exactly the time she needed it most, because the insurance had been tied to the business, and when the business was gone, all she had left was a dialysis appointment and a bill. Marley left in September. The girl discovered that the tuition money her father had told her was already paid had actually been withdrawn to cover the spoiled inventory in the cold storage room, and she found out when the school called, which meant nearly a year after he had first begun lying to her. She didn't argue with him. She simply packed her things and left. And she told her mother that she wasn't angry about the money. She was angry that for an entire year he had kept asking her how school was going. Harlan Boyd believed someone was doing all of this to him. He believed it because believing that was easier. And one afternoon in October, he went to the office in Federal Hill, stood at the door with his hat still in his hands, and asked to be seen. They let him in. Emilio Vitali sat behind his desk and didn't stand. Harlan spoke quickly, saying he knew he had been wrong, saying please, saying his wife was sick, saying he would repay whatever had to be repaid in whatever way was necessary, only asking them to stop. Emilio let him finish. Then he said he hadn't done anything. Harlan didn't believe him, and it showed plainly on his face. Emilio didn't argue. He pushed the stack of papers in front of him slightly aside, and he began telling an entirely different story. He said that many years ago, on this very street, there had been a bakery that opened early and closed late. He said there was a pregnant woman working the evening shift there, and one rainy night, she dropped a tray of bread. He said the tray broke. He said the owner told her to go outside, and she went outside, and no one in the bakery followed her. He said that night the woman gave birth in the waiting room of a charity clinic 3 blocks away, on a bench, and the person who helped deliver the baby was a cleaning woman. Harlan sat still. He didn't understand yet why he was being told any of this. Then Emilio said it, and he said it slowly, no louder than anything he had said before, looking directly into the face of the man across the desk. Mr. Boyd, I don't need to touch you. I never did. Because the night you turned off the lights on the sales floor and left a pregnant woman outside the glass asking for 1 phone call, you didn't throw a cashier out into the rain. You threw out my mother. You threw out the very woman who gave birth to me on a bench in a waiting room. Only the name was different, and a few decades had passed. And the worst part isn't that you did it once on one stormy night. The worst part is that you did exactly the same thing every day, to every person you could only see as an employee number. So now go home. Go home and live long enough to understand who you kept pushing out through your door. Harlan Boyd couldn't stand immediately. He remained there with both hands gripping the brim of his hat, and they had to wait a while before someone could escort him out. The story reached June's Market within 2 days, because in that neighborhood nothing traveled any farther than that before everyone knew. Delaney closed the store earlier than usual that day, left the baby with Ezra, and went to the office. She didn't sit down. She said she hadn't come to talk about forgiveness, and she said she hadn't forgiven him either. She said she had come for one reason only. Then she said no one was to touch Harlan Boyd. She said that if her daughter could grow up safe only because people were afraid of Emilio, then she didn't want that kind of safety. Emilio looked at her for a long time. Then he said he promised. He added no conditions, offered no explanation, asked no questions. And after that, he told her something he had never told anyone, that on that night he had already driven past the bus shelter. He said he had gone another 2 blocks. Then he said he turned the car around. The morning shift employee mentioned it while opening a box of bread, casually, the way someone might talk about the weather. saying there was an old man sitting in a car out in the parking lot, that today made the 4th day, that he never got out, never came inside, just sat there until around 6 o'clock and then drove away. Delaney wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. It was still dark outside, and there was only one car in the lot, parked far away, with a man sitting behind the wheel, both hands resting on it, staring straight at the brightly lit windows of the store. He saw her. He didn't move, didn't roll down the window, didn't raise a hand. Delaney stood on the front step and looked at him for a while, long enough to be certain. Then she went back inside, locked the door, slid the bolt into place, and walked straight into the office in the back. She sat there until full daylight, and until it was time to open, and when she came back out, the car was gone. She didn't tell anyone. 2 days later, Emilio came to the store in the late afternoon, during a quiet hour. He didn't buy anything. He stood at the end of the counter and asked Delaney a strange question. Who had given her the stool on the night she was made to clean the floor in the frozen food aisle? Delaney said it had been Mr. Ezra. He nodded, and she saw that he nodded like someone who had just confirmed something he already knew. He said he had spoken with Teodora. He said she had worked at the bakery when she was young, not for long, only a few seasons, and that she still remembered the names of the people who had worked there. Ezra Pike was stocking shelves in the inner aisle. His hands had stopped moving the moment he heard the words bakery. He stood there with one hand still resting on a cardboard box, his back turned, and he remained that way so long that Delaney finally had to call his name. He turned around. He walked over to them, pulled the little stool from the corner, and sat down. And he sat on that stool like a man who knew he wouldn't be able to remain standing if he told this story on his feet. He said he had been 28 years old back then. He said he had worked as a helper at the bakery on Atwell Street, carrying trays and washing pans, and he had worked the evening shift. He said he had been there that night. He told the story very slowly, without looking at anyone. He said the tray that fell had been a tray for hard bread, and it was the tray that broke, not the bread that fell, an enamel tray that shattered and sent pieces across the floor. He said the woman had been heavily pregnant, and she bent down to pick them up, and the owner told her not to bother, told her to go outside. He said it was raining. He said he had been standing closest to the door, closer than anyone else in that kitchen, so close that 3 steps would have taken him outside. Then he said the thing he had carried for more than 30 years, that he hadn't taken those steps. He said he bent down and picked up the broken pieces. He said he picked them up one by one, very carefully, and kept picking until the floor was completely clean. And he took so long because as long as he stayed bent over, he didn't have to raise his head and look toward the door. He said he hadn't known who she was, hadn't known her name, and it wasn't until years later that he heard where she had given birth that night. He sat in silence for a while, then told the rest. He said he had stayed silent once when he was 28. Then he said he had stayed silent one more time, in that other store, on the stormy night, when he had set down the box of canned goods and meant to step forward and then remained exactly where he was, and he said he had stood there in exactly the same way he had stood more than 30 years earlier, and that after all that time he still hadn't learned how to speak when it mattered. When he finished, he sat quietly with both hands braced on his knees, and he didn't cry, but his shoulders collapsed in the way of someone who had finally set down something he had carried for far too long. Delaney said nothing. She looked toward Emilio. He was standing at the end of the counter, looking at the old man sitting on the stool, and it was a long while before he spoke. He said his mother had told that story once every year, always near his birthday. He said she told it the same way every time, with the same details, the enamel tray, the rain, the bench in the waiting room. Then he said there was one more part she always included, every single time, that there had been a young man in the kitchen that night who bent down to pick up the broken pieces, and that he cried while he picked them up. Ezra Pike looked up. Emilio said his mother had never been angry with him. He said she had felt sorry for him, and she had carried that compassion for him through all those years, because she knew that young man would have to carry that night much longer than she ever would. The store was silent. Outside, a car passed in the street, and somewhere farther down the block came the sound of another shop's doorbell. Ezra sat on the little stool, raised one hand to cover his eyes, and this time he cried. The rain began that afternoon, and by the time Delaney locked the store, the parking lot was covered in large pools of standing water. The old car was still parked at the far end. This time the door opened, and the man got out and walked across the lot toward her, with nothing covering his head. Delaney stopped beneath the awning. Harlan Boyd stopped a few steps away from her. Then he lowered himself to his knees on the wet concrete. He said he had come to ask for work. He said anything would do. Sweeping, carrying boxes, night shifts, even without pay. And after saying that, he added that his wife had a dialysis appointment the day after tomorrow, and he couldn't afford it. He said he had asked everywhere in the neighborhood, and no one would hire him, and that he knew why. Water ran down his face. He said he wasn't asking her to forgive him, that he knew he had no right to ask for that. He was only asking for 2 days. Delaney stood still. She looked down at the man kneeling before her on the rain-soaked concrete, and many things passed through her mind all at once, and she didn't say a single word about any of them. She took out her phone. She called the clinic where she still took the little girl for her vaccinations and asked for the number of the kidney department at the central hospital. Then she called again, and she stood beneath the awning, talking for about 10 minutes, giving a name, giving the date of birth Harlan had to tell her, confirming that she would be the one paying. She ended the call and told him his wife had an appointment the next morning, then told him to stand up. He didn't stand immediately. He asked why. He asked it in the voice of someone who truly didn't understand. And he said after everything he had done to her, why? Delaney said that on that night, a stranger had already driven past her and then turned the car around. She said he hadn't owed her anything. She said she owed that man, though, and she had spent a long time trying to think of a way to repay him and never found one, and this was the only way she knew how. Then she told Harlan to go home before he got soaked. The next morning, she took Cheryl to the hospital. The woman was thin and needed something to hold onto when she walked, and during the 4 hours they sat there, she barely spoke. Near the end, she asked Delaney to hand her the bag beneath the chair. From inside it, she took an old phone, the kind that hadn't been sold in years, and placed it in Delaney's hand. She said there was a recording on it. She said she had been standing at the customer service counter that night, and she had recorded everything from the beginning until the lights went out. Delaney didn't open it to watch. Cheryl said she had promised herself that if Delaney didn't make it through that night, she would take the recording to the police station. She said that the next morning she heard Delaney had survived, and she put it away. She said she had been standing about 6 steps from her, that she had legs, that she had a mouth. She simply hadn't had the courage. And she said it very calmly, like someone who had said those words to herself every night for 3 years, so saying them aloud now was no longer difficult. Then she took one more thing from the bag. It was an envelope, with a stamp already on it, addressed by hand to Delaney Marsh, with a handwritten date in the corner from 2 years earlier. It had never been mailed. Cheryl said he had written it that summer, after hearing that Delaney was still alive and had given birth. She said he had put the stamp on it, written the address, and carried it all the way to the mailbox at the end of the street. Then she said he had brought it back home and kept it in a drawer, and every so often he would take it out, read it, then put it away again. And she said that envelope was the only part left of the man she had married. Delaney took it home, placed it in the desk drawer, and didn't open it until several days later. The following week, the bank called again about the loan for the refrigeration system. They said the application was in order and that the only thing still missing was proof of her medical payment history, and told her to ask the hospital to print another copy of her old records. Delaney went to the central hospital, waited in line at the administrative desk, and they printed a stack of papers for her. She sat down on the row of chairs in the hallway and went through them to make sure everything was there. The first page was the treatment summary. The second was the statement of charges. At the bottom of that statement, beneath the section showing the source of payment, there was a line of small print that Delaney had skimmed once 3 years earlier, without thinking anything of it. This time, beneath that line, the hospital had printed an additional note from the fund, something that hadn't appeared on the paper she had signed back then. The note said that the Giuseppina Fund had been established by Miss Giuseppina Vitale for uninsured expectant mothers admitted to the hospital in emergency condition, and beneath it was a line quoting the founder's wish that the fund had been created so that from that day forward, no woman in this city would ever have to give birth in a waiting room again. Beside it was the year the fund had been established. Delaney stared at that number. Exactly 1 year after the rainy night at the bakery on Atwell Street, Harlan Boyd began his first shift at June's Market on a Monday morning at 6 o'clock, and he wasn't assigned a register at all. He worked stocking the morning shelves under Ezra Pike, and Ezra was the one who gave him his tasks. On the first day, he arranged 2 rows of canned goods incorrectly, because he was still used to the layout of the old store, and Ezra simply walked past, turned a few cans so the labels faced the right way, then kept going. Near noon, an older woman dropped her wallet at the end of the counter, and loose change scattered across the floor. Harlan was carrying a box past at the time. He set the box down. He lowered himself onto one knee and helped her pick everything up, including the coins that had rolled beneath the bottom shelf, then handed them back to her with both hands and told her she should count them again just to be sure. The woman thanked him and left. Harlan stood, brushed off his hands, and picked up the box again. That afternoon, when his shift ended, Ezra walked over carrying a folded apron, the blue cloth kind everyone there wore, and handed it to Harlan. He didn't say anything. Harlan took it, and he held it for a long time before unfolding it. During that same season, one evening after closing, Gio Falcone came in. He had aged considerably, grown thinner, and he was wearing the uniform of a warehouse security company on the south side of the city, working the night shift. He didn't apologize. He placed a thick bundle of documents tied with string on the counter and said there were other cases inside. He said that through all the years he had done the work he did, this hadn't been the only time he had changed a word on paper, and he had sat down and forced himself to remember every one of them and had written down each case, each name, each family. He said Emilio had told him to find them himself, to go door to door, and not to ask anyone else to do it for him. He said he had found almost all of them. He said there were still 2 families who had moved out of state, and whom he hadn't been able to trace. Then he said she was the last person on that list whose door he hadn't had the courage to knock on, and now he had knocked. Delaney pulled the file toward her. She untied the string, looked through several pages, then tied it closed again. She said she would help him find the other 2 families. The wedding was held the following spring at the small church in Federal Hill, with only about 20 guests. Teodora held baby June throughout the ceremony, and halfway through, the little girl fell asleep against her shoulder, with one hand clutching the collar of her dress. Ezra Pike sat in the second row. The store closed for exactly 1 day, and a handwritten note taped to the front window said they would reopen as usual the next morning. That summer, June's Market opened a second location on the west side of the city, and in the employment contracts for both stores, on the final page, the same 2 lines that had hung behind the counter from the very first day were printed again. Then, one rainy evening, close to closing time, Delaney was standing behind the counter balancing the books when she looked up through the front window. Outside in the parking lot, beneath the rain, Harlan Boyd was holding an umbrella over one of the evening employees as he walked her all the way to her car. He slowed his steps to match hers, and he waited until the car door had closed completely before turning back toward the store, one shoulder soaked through. Delaney watched him. She never told anyone about it. Not that night, and not ever. She finished adding the final column of numbers, closed the ledger, turned off the lights in the sales area, and went home. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths. A person's real power isn't measured by what he can do to someone weaker than himself, but by what he chooses not to do. A person's dignity doesn't depend on the title printed on an employee badge, or on where that person slept the night before. And the door we close today may very well be the same door we find ourselves standing before tomorrow, asking someone to open. If this story touched you, please leave a like and send it to someone you think needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so that every day another story of kindness can find its way to you. And how did today's story make you feel? If you have ever stood on the other side of a closed door, or if you have ever been the person who opened one for someone else, please write a few words in the comments. We truly want to hear what is deep in your heart. We wish you and your family good health, joy in every day, and a life filled with peace. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.